Well, good evening. Before we start, as is the want these days, I'd like to make an acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge all those people that have come to this country in the last 250 plus years, whose commitment of hard work and dedication has made Australia the great country it is today. Thank you. Thank you. I grew up in a little country town called Leonora. And living in Leonora in the 1950s was like living on the moon. And at my first opportunity, I got out of there. And in 1966, I joined the Australian Navy. I served for 5 years in surface ships, including tours to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, so on. In 1971, I travelled to the United Kingdom as I'd volunteered for submarine service. I qualified as a submarine sailor in the United Kingdom on board a Royal Navy submarine called HMS Opportune. I returned to Australia and served in Australian submarines in a variety of capacities up until 1987. I left the Navy in 1987 and worked for a defence contracting company and was involved in the work on the Collins-class submarine for the next 20 years. I've also had a hand in the development of the future combat systems, weapon systems and electronic systems for the submarines through the years, upgrades and so on. Now the motto of the submarine service is we come unseen. This is submarines worldwide, we come unseen. And because of the nature of their work, little is common knowledge of the silent service. I would pose a question to you: what do submarines do? Well, they patrol the world's oceans. There is a famous quote by a fellow called Edwin Gray, who said that every minute of the day there are thousands of men and women who live and work beneath the surface of the ocean as the submarines of the world's navies ply their traditional occasions. They all do so legally, and they all do so with the same risk of death and destruction. Now, having said that, submarines are only in the news when something untoward happens. And as we're aware, everyone who's never been on one is an instant expert. I'm going to talk to you about Australian submarines, and I'll dispel a few myths. Please feel free to ask questions. I will dispel a few myths as we go through. You're not going to see the Hollywoodised version. Australian submarines. We currently operate 6 Collins-class submarines. They're based down here at Stirling, and they range around the world. And they have done so from AE1 in 1914 to the new AUKUS program. I'm going to talk about the AUKUS program, but please bear in mind it's very dynamic, it's very fluid. If you don't read the newspaper, you are uninformed. If you do read the newspaper, you are misinformed. Be aware of that. 1914, 2 submarines arrived in Australia, AE1 and AE2. In those days, submarines were given numbers, not names. They were British E-class submarines, AE1, Australian E-class number 1 and Australian E-class number 2. They, at the outbreak of World War I, they were sent to New Guinea to curtail any German operations in that area. Bear in mind there was a lot of German activity in northern New Guinea, New Britain. In 1914, on the 14th of September, AE1 was lost, disappeared off Rabaul with all hands. AE2 survived, came back to Australia and was promptly dispatched across to the Mediterranean, where it was the first Allied submarine to penetrate the Dardanelles, closely followed by a British submarine called E11 under the command of a fellow called Eric Dunbar Naismith. AE2 was commanded by Henry Dacre Stoker. They sank a Turkish cruiser called the Aurora, and both AE1, or AE2 I should say, and E11 had simple instructions: run amok. And that's what they did. AE2 was attacked by a Turkish gunboat on the 30th of April 1915. The crew were evacuated and they scuttled the submarine, and it's still there. I do recall a fellow called Ian McLeod coming here and talking to you about AE2 sitting on the bottom of the Mediterranean, the Sea of Marmara. In 1917, a research team located the wreckage of AE1. Lying in deep water off the Duke of York Island. They will not reveal the exact position because they don't want people up there scavenging it. As you can see, something has happened here that has caused the implosion of the pressure hull up around the forward hatches. Probably a hatch that did not seal. After World War I, 1919, Australia was gifted 6 J-class submarines from the Royal Navy. They were based in Geelong and they didn't go anywhere. They were in such poor mechanical condition they spent their entire lives under repair. In 1921, the Australian government decided to get rid of them, and they were all sunk as breakwaters in Port Phillip Bay. 3 of them are still visible in Port Phillip Bay. After the debacle of the J-class, Australia purchased 2 Odin-class submarines called Oxley and Otway. They came out to Australia in 1929, but by 1931 economic conditions were such they couldn't afford to run them and they were returned to the Royal Navy. In a quirk of fate, Oxley, now HMS Oxley, was torpedoed and sunk off Norway by another British submarine. Yeah, friendly fire. So Australia had no submarines through the 30s. But during World War II, 1942, March 1942, the Americans arrived in force in Fremantle. It's a little known fact that during World War II, Fremantle was the 2nd largest Allied submarine base in the world. Between 1942 and 1945, there were 122 American, 31 British and 9 Dutch submarines based in Fremantle. The British had been operating submarines in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. The Mediterranean, they were very successful. They basically destroyed the Italian Navy. But during that, they lost a submarine tender. With it, they lost spare torpedoes, machinery, spare parts, but most importantly, they lost a lot of experienced maintainers. So a decision was made not to send the submarine tenders out to the submarines, but keep the tenders in port and make the submarines come to them. And they did. This is USS Fliers tied up in North Wharf in Fremantle with some American, what they call fleet boats, Blao-class submarines. Now, you may notice today submarines don't have guns on them. Submarines initially had guns on them because their firing gear to fire the torpedoes was such they had to surface to do so. So they needed a gun for protection. During World War II, they found that it was easy for the submarines, particularly the American submarines, to get out to the remote islands the Japanese had occupied, surface and do a shore bombardment, then dive and go away. A surface ship or aircraft couldn't get out there. And some of the American submarines carried 2 5-inch guns. So they were very heavily armed. The British submarines, also T and S-class submarines were out here. They were very successful. The Americans tended to operate out of Pearl Harbor, do a patrol up in the South China Sea, then come down to Fremantle. Go back to the South China Sea, then go back to Pearl Harbor. The British ran out of a place called Trincomalee in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. They ran from there to the Malay Barrier and then down to Fremantle and then reverse on the return trip. After the war, 1949, the British still maintain a large fleet in Singapore called the Far East Fleet. And part of the Far East Fleet was the 4th Submarine Flotilla, which they based in Sydney, in Middle Harbour in Sydney. Old T-class submarines, Tabard, Trump, Taciturn. They were very good submarines, but they weren't ours. The Minister for the Navy back in the early 60s was a fellow called John Gorton, a former RAAF pilot, and he lobbied hard for Australia to get submarines, seeing as the British were about to withdraw from Singapore and indeed the Far East. So in 1967, Australia took delivery of the first of its Oberon-class submarines, HMAS Oxley, very quickly followed by 3 others, Otway, Ovens and Onslow. In the 1970s, 2 more were purchased, Orion and Atama. Interestingly, the first 4 plus spare parts cost $9 million. The next 2 cost $53 million. Inflation. You can't help it.
Was that each or the whole lot?
That's for the whole lot. Oh yeah. Cheap and effective. The Oberons in the late 70s underwent a major overhaul called a SWUP, a Submarine Weapons Upgrade Program. They were fitted with new sonars, long-range sonars, and a long-range heavyweight torpedo. I was most fortunate. I served on a submarine called Otway and did the initial Mark 48 heavyweight torpedo discharge trials out at Pearl Harbor in 1975. Now, I'm going to kill a myth here. Submarines are passive. They're not active. That is, they do not transmit or ping on their sonar. They listen. You ever see a movie where the submarine's pinging on its sonar, even if John Wayne's in it, it's a load of rubbish, because they do not do it. They listen. And they have an extremely sophisticated sonar suite on board. They have broadband sonars looking out around the submarine for the broadband noise, the noise of the ship moving through the water. Once they find that noise, they need to identify that ship by classifying the narrowband noise. And that's what that dome on the bow is for. That classifies the narrowband targets. The sonar operators on the submarines are very highly trained. It would take them no more than about 30 seconds to tell you everything you need to know about the ship other than the captain's name. And I've had a few try that. The Oberons were by far and away at that time the most successful conventional submarine in the world, without doubt. There were 27 of them built, 13 for the UK, 6 for Australia, 3 for Canada, 2 for Brazil and 2 for Chile. The last Brazilian submarine sank about 3 years ago, sank alongside for lack of maintenance. In the late 80s, the Navy decided, under a new government with a new Defence Minister, Mr. Kim Beazley, to get new submarines. And they opted for the Swedish Type 471 Kockums design, which was known as the Collins class. After a few initial teething problems, they're not overly concerned. There were problems. You build a house, it's going to cost you $200,000, you're going to have some problems with it. You build 6 submarines that cost $5.5 billion, you're going to have a few problems with them. But they ironed them out. By the time the media were reporting the problems with the Collins class submarine, they had been long rectified. You're misinformed again. The Collins class today are, again, by far and away the most advanced and effective conventional submarine in the world. I kid you not, gents. They deploy all over. By virtue of our position in Southeast Asia, Australia has a very long or very large area to patrol. The Australian submarines operate up into the Gulf, down to the Antarctic, up into Japan and Russia, and out into the Pacific. So they need long range, they need endurance. Submarines will be at sea dived for up to 3 months at a time. So the people that are on them are literally hand-picked. It's a volunteer service. You put your hand up, say I want to be a submarine sailor. You undergo some very stringent medical and psychological testing, some very thorough training. One of the, I guess one of the things that submarine sailors have to do is to know how to operate every single piece of equipment on board. Now that is simply because they might be the only person in an area when something happens. They have to know what to do. And they're very good. They're very, very good, very well trained. The Indo-Pacific region does pose some challenges. Conventional submarines have to be refuelled. The submarines, believe it or not, will carry in excess of 100,000 gallons of dieseline. They have batteries, huge batteries, over 200 tonnes of batteries, the weight of an A380 Airbus jumbo jet. When those batteries are charged, they would have enough electrical capacity to provide for the needs of the average suburban home for about 2 years. Run their main motors flat out, they've got a matter of hours. They have 3,000, 4,000 horsepower electric motors, and they just chew the juice out of the box. So they have to conserve power. So this was taken into consideration when in 2007, under the Rudd government, planning for the next generation of Australian submarines began. Project C-1000 was announced in December of that year. Those of you familiar with projects within the Defence Department, they come in 3 categories: sea, air, land. If the Army wants to build boats, it's a sea project. If the Air Force want Land Rovers, it's a land project. If the Navy want helicopters, it's an air project. So it doesn't mean that sea is just for the Navy. It can be for everybody. In 2008, the project was established within DMO. That means that they could now start to look at purchasing equipment, looking at facilities, working out what they needed to do. And a selection process was announced in 2015. We're dealing with public servants here. They take 45 minutes to go and make a cup of tea. I'm sorry if you're a public servant.
Protest.
Well, we used to say public servants aren't and don't. Now, on 20th of February 2015, the key strategic criteria was announced. The options that the government was faced with: by a military off-the-shelf design, a MOTS design without modification. There are plenty of countries around the world, you can go to them and say, design us a submarine, and they will do it. Develop a modified MOTS design to better suit Australian service conditions. We've done that before with the Collins. And many countries have done that. Yes, we want this type of submarine, but we want this on it, and we want that on it. Design an evolution of the Collins class, which was very much at the forefront of the decision making, or design an entirely new class of submarine, which is the most expensive one. But it is also the most effective one, because you go and buy a car and you want to put different wheels on it, you want to rip out the seats and put nice flashy seats in it, fine, you can do that, but why not go and buy one that's already got that on it? It might cost you a little bit more, but it's going to save you a lot of angst. The options that came about very quickly: the German Type 214 submarine. Now they're built by HDW, Holzwerk. There's also IKL, there's another German designer and producer of submarines, but they build coastal submarines. Their submarines are very short range. You get a submarine based in Wilhelmshaven in Germany, they sail out of port, at breakfast time, at lunchtime, they're in foreign waters. One of our submarines sails out of the base down here, you've got to go 2 weeks before you get out of Australian waters. So they were very quickly disregarded, very small. The Japanese Soryu class, very, very good submarine. But there are still, to this day, limitations upon the Japanese with what military equipment they can export. So that was scrubbed. The short fin Barracuda, the French put up as a conventional version of their Suffren class, nuclear-powered submarine. Now, the short fin Barracuda sort of resonated with the Navy, because when we went to look at the Collins class, the French put up their then nuclear submarine called the Rubis. And the Australian government said, but it's nuclear powered. And the French, being the French, said, take out the reactor and put in a diesel. So they had the same attitude here. But this is a nuclear submarine. Take out the reactor, put in a diesel. It doesn't work like that. You can't take a motor out of a Mini and drop in a nice big Chevy V8. Don't work. Another submarine that was offered was the Swedish Blekinge. And there were 2 reasons why this submarine was knocked back. First and foremost, it was the first submarine the Swedes had designed since the Collins class. No, don't want that. Secondly, this is an air-independent propulsion submarine. That is, it carries large tanks of liquid oxygen to run the diesels when the submarine's dived. It'd be like sitting on top on the space shuttle, sitting on one of those great big rockets. You've got this, massive explosive power sitting there with you. I don't know about you, but I didn't think I'd like that. So the Australian government went with the Barracuda class, the Submarine, the short fin Barracuda. Take out the reactor, put in the diesel. That was the obvious solution, apart from going to build a new submarine. Now we had some sticking points. The French wanted to build the submarines in France, Australia wanted to build them in Australia. Bit of argy-bargy, the French settled for, we'll build the first one in France and the rest can be built in Australia. Well, the French are currently building the Submarine class, and from cutting the steel to putting the submarine into service has taken them 15 years. So we weren't going to wait that long. Then on top of that, the French wanted, we carry their heavyweight torpedoes, their Exocet missiles. No, we already had the heavyweight torpedo. The Mark 48 Mod 7 is a very effective weapon. I kid you not, gentlemen, it has a range of 50 kilometres and a speed of over 100 kilometres an hour. You are not going to outrun them. Underwater. The Mark 48 Mod 7 was developed...
What's it powered by?
It's powered by Otto fuel. Otto fuel is, Glenn knows this, polyethanol benzyl dinitrate with assembled butyrate stabiliser.
That's right.
One cup will lift 1 tonne straight up in 1 second.
So is it a piston engine?
It's a piston engine. It has a single piston. Yeah. That piston will strike a swash plate. The swash plate converts the vertical motion into a centrifugal motion that drives a pump jet propulsor. You fire that weapon, it's gone 100 metres, it's doing 100 kilometres an hour. Boom, away they go. I beg your pardon?
The Otto fuel was designed by Otto Rettlinger.
That's right, Rettlinger. I was trying to think of his name, thank you. I knew you'd know it.
I know.
He knows everything, just ask him. He knows my wife.
That's good. She gives me the answers.
Yeah. Also, Australia has the Harpoon anti-ship missiles. Over the years, Australia's developed their own software to be able to integrate the Harpoon into our weapons inventory with minimal change. We don't have to buy any extra pieces of equipment. It'll fit into the existing combat systems. So there again becomes sticking points. And then the Americans, God bless them, said, you buy the French submarine, you won't get Mark 48 torpedoes or Harpoon missiles. On the 15th of September 2021, the Morrison government said, hang it, we'll go nuclear. Let's get rid of this problem and we'll go nuclear. And the AUKUS Pact was developed. Now, a lot of people think they know what AUKUS is. The Australia, UK, US agreement. And AUKUS comes in 2 pillars. Pillar 1, nuclear-powered submarines. Pillar 2, technology. In Pillar 1, the US and the UK will share nuclear propulsion technology with Australia. This is not as simple as it seems. The US, believe it or not, has the patent on nuclear propulsion. They license it to be used in the UK. The UK, God bless them, gave it to the Russians, who gave it to the Chinese, and away they went. Sharing nuclear propulsion technology is not just a matter of going up to them and saying, we want to get nuclear submarines. It has to be passed by both governments, which it has been, on the commitment that the Royal Australian Navy acquires at least 8 nuclear-powered submarines armed with conventional weapons. I stress conventional weapons. We are not a nuclear power. We do not have nuclear weapons. We do not have a nuclear industry. Oh, you can go down to the hospital and go to the Department of Nuclear Medicine. That radioactivity they have in there wouldn't lift your lid. The technology component is a little bit different. It's improving joint capabilities and interoperability. Special technologies, artificial intelligence, undersea capabilities. Each country that operates submarines will develop their own method of operating submarines, their own rules, routines, regulations and so on. There are 2 rules in submarine warfare. Rule 1, don't get caught. Rule 2, don't break rule number 1. That's as simple as that. Now, other countries wanted to get into Pillar 2. Brazil, Canada, New Zealand, India, Korea or South Korea, Japan. But there are sticking points in there. We don't share intelligence with anybody. There's an agreement within Australia called Five Eyes: UK, US, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. No one else gets it. Okay, that is a written. Brazil have indicated they want to get nuclear submarines, but Brazil is bankrupt, so I don't think they're going to go anywhere with that. The countries that operate nuclear submarines are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. The United States, that currently operates around about 74 submarines. Russia, with 45. How many work, we don't know. I'll tell you a story with the Russian submarines. One of their submarines was a Sierra-class nuclear-powered attack submarine, being built in the shipyard, and the local city repossessed it because they hadn't paid their power bill. So, you know, you've got to think about this. Are they workable or not? The UK has 11, France has 10, China 14, and India has 2. India is the only non-member of the Security Council that has nuclear submarines. They are what they call indigenous submarines, the Arahant class. The Indians developed their own submarine by leasing an old Charlie-class nuclear attack submarine from the Russians for about 12 years and reverse engineered it. The Indian Navy, by the way, is very, very powerful, very modern. As human beings, we are normally wary or even afraid of things we don't understand. And I don't think too many people understand how nuclear propulsion works. It is basically a heat source to boil the kettle. With the Australian submarines, they're not going to build the reactors here. We do not have a nuclear industry. The British reactors are built by Rolls-Royce. The American reactors are built by Westinghouse and General Electric. And they would come as a sealed unit, basically a plug-and-play unit. They have enriched uranium control rods, which are inserted into what is known as heavy water because it's now being radiated and it heats. It will now have a pressuriser that forces that water into the steam generator and it just continually circles around. Simple as that. On the other side, there is a little pump, brings water in from the ocean, pumps it up into the steam generator where it's converted to steam, now goes to the main turbine, reduction gearing, the clutch, the propulsion motor and the thrust block to drive the screws, or the propulsor. There's also a turbo generator here that generates power for the submarine. The green line is basically where the power goes. Now, in this sense, there'd be a plug there, basically, that you're going to plug it in. You won't access the reactor, and it will be a sealed unit, totally sealed. The generators can actually charge up a battery, so you've got battery power if you need it. Submarines have 2 main sources of power. One is called military power, and that is specialised power to power such things as your sonar, your weapon systems, your navigation equipment, your communications gear, stuff you can't buy at Harvey Norman. Then they have hotel power, and hotel power will allow you to cook meals, have air conditioning, have fridges and freezers, stuff you can buy at Harvey Norman. They're the 2 power supplies you're going to need, and they will come basically from the motor generators. Nuclear power, to all intents and purposes, is quite simple, but people have this, it's going to blow up, it'll kill us all. No, it won't. As soon as Australia announced, let's get nuclear submarines, the French came back on the scene with their Submarines. Hey, here it is, all ready to go. You don't have to rip out the reactor and put in a diesel, we've got one. But the Australian government at that time said no, The ancillaries were too difficult. Getting them to agree to us having American weapons, having the Americans say you can put our weapon systems into a French-built submarine, become a bit of a no-no. So there are two options. There are two builds going on at the moment, if you discount the French. The Americans are building the Virginia class, a 774 nuclear-powered attack submarine, started in around about 2000. They now have about 26 of them, I think, running around. The British building the Astutes. The Astutes, they came about probably in about 2016 or so. The Astutes, however, from cutting the steel to putting the submarine in the service is taking around 10 years. There's a reason for that. There's only one shipyard that builds them, and that is a shipyard at Barrow in Furness, Vickers Shipbuilding, and they're also building the new Dreadnought class ballistic missile submarine. And they want to keep the workforce intact so that as they rotate through the submarines, by the time the last one comes online, the first one's going to come in for a major overhaul. And they need those people. They don't want to have dismissals en masse. The Virginias, when they started building, the Americans stipulated they wanted a 60-month build time. They got that down to 44 months. Every submarine coming out, or submarine coming out every 44 months. They had what they called a 3-2-3. 3 this year, 2 next year, 3 the following year. And then COVID hit. COVID gets blamed for everything, but their shipyards basically shut down. So they redesigned the build structure for the Virginias. The bow section of the Virginia was built at Northrop Grumman's electric boat division in Groton in Connecticut, and the propulsion unit, the after half of the submarine, was built at Huntington Ingalls at Newport News in Virginia. I've actually worked at Raytheon on the Virginia class submarines, putting the new combat systems communications gear into them. The front of the submarine is then loaded onto a barge and towed down to Huntington Ingalls, where they join them together. The Americans have just announced they're going to slow down this build time. Instead of building 2 per year, they are going to slow it down to 3 every 2 years. So they can keep the shipyard going. Otherwise they just get overload. Huntington Ingalls is something like about 15 months behind schedule. So it's pointless having the front of these submarines sitting around waiting for the back half to be built. Newport News Shipbuilding, Huntington Ingalls at Newport News, they're not only building the Virginias, they build the American aircraft carriers. They're big. There's 3 of them on the go there at the moment. Whereas Groton are not only building the Virginias, they're also building the Columbia class, the new ballistic missile submarine. So their yards are full, absolutely full. And they have said in no uncertain terms, there's no way we can build you a submarine. No way. The Australian government accepts that. The media doesn't. The same with the Astutes. No way will they be built in the UK. Now the Virginias. They're an excellent submarine. The Americans have got this down pat. They're building them in blocks. Now what a block is, they have a software technology and they will gate it and say that submarine will be built to this particular level. The next batch of submarines, Block 2, will be built to this level. When these ones come in for an overhaul, they'll be upgraded to that level. And that's the way they do it. With the Astutes, on the other hand, the first submarine is literally obsolete because they've got to continue to upgrade everything they've got on board. The construction of the nuclear submarine is quite simple. The structure of any submarine is quite simple. It is basically a cylinder called a pressure hull. Inside the pressure hull are all your working spaces, your machinery spaces, your accommodation spaces and so on. Now bulging out around the pressure hull are the saddle tanks or the main ballast tanks, and these are used to dive and surface a submarine. The tanks will be open along the bottom. The holes are called free floods. To dive the submarine, vents on top of the tanks are open, the air comes out of the tanks, water comes up through the free floods. These submarines will take on about 620 tonnes of water that'll pull them under. Literally instantly. They're gone in a second. To surface the submarine, they shut the vents on top of the tanks and blow high pressure air into the tanks. It expels the water out through the free floods, fills the tanks full of air, and up they pop. And they can do that as many times as they like, because on board they have what are called high packs, high pressure air compressors, and they're running as soon as the submarine's getting air into it. The submarine can do a gulp, as it's called. Rather than have to surface, they can come up to periscope depth, put a mast out of the water and suck air in. Virginias have torpedo tubes, only 4 torpedo tubes, but they have what's called a VPM, a Virginia Payload Module, vertical launch tubes, 12 of them, and in the American submarines they can fire any missile in their inventory. Tomahawks, tactical land attack missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, they can fire Shrikes, Sea Sparrows, you name it, they can fire them.
What's that depth?
The depth they can fire them at?
The height of the missile.
The height.
The length of it to fit in the sub. 10 feet? 20?
Oh no, a Harpoon, if I remember rightly, now I've got to, you've cast me back here. A Harpoon is around about 5.5 metres long.
Okay.
The T-Lambs, the Tomahawks, are probably about 6.5 metres long. The Tomahawks have a range of 1,200 kilometres. They're phenomenal. You may have seen them during the Gulf War, putting down the street, hanging right at the lights and blowing up a building. Oh yeah, they're very, very effective weapon. And they can fire them from probably 150, 200 metres down. They're a very effective submarine. It's very effective.
You said there were 12 missiles?
12, they have 12 cylinders, 12 launch tubes for the missiles. They can carry whatever missiles. If they're going to carry what's called a Sea Sparrow, an SM, Evolved Sea Sparrow missile, they put into the tube what's called a plenum. It's like an insert that divides that tube into 4, and they can put 4 missiles in each tube. And the way it's designed is when the missile will have a booster on it, and when they fire it, that booster will actually exhaust into the bottom of the plenum, which will give it the impetus to thrust it up out of the tube. And away they go. On the Virginia class, the Block 1, 2, 3 and 4, they are there. On the Block 5s, they've also got another one down the back. These ones have 12, the Block 5s have 24. Pretty powerful submarines. As you can see, they're quite a large submarine. Sitting in the dry dock there at Huntington Ingalls, waiting to be floated out. We don't launch submarines anymore, they don't slide down the slipway like they used to do. They're in a dock here, they just flood the dock and drive it out. Quicker. The Astutes, the British Astutes, as you see, they're a slightly different configuration to the cylindrical shape of the Virginias. The British do have this design that they like, the flat nose with the hydroplanes in the bow. The British like to embellish things more so than the Americans. The Americans say, no, there's 45 weapons in there. The British will say there are more weapons in there, like 27 Olympic swimming pools. They've got to do that. One of the things I see here, it tells me about stores, and it says here, enough food to stay at sea for 3 months. Crew will eat 18,000 sausages and 4,200 Weetabix for breakfast on a 10-week patrol. I can assure you submarine sailors do not eat Weetabix for breakfast. There's no milk on board. You wanted milk? It's in the cow tied to the banana tree up in the tube space. You don't have milk. But these submarines are a very advanced design. I was in Cumbria a few years ago, and they had the bow section of one of these submarines coming through the streets of Barrow on the back of a truck. I thought it was a space shuttle. It was huge, you know. It's like an iceberg. Most of it is underwater. There's the waterline. Okay, these are sonars. The hydroplanes. You've got forward hydroplanes, you've got after hydroplanes. They work in conjunction to control the dive angle and the depth of the submarine. Submarines are quite manoeuvrable.
Wow.
Okay, the Americans used to have them on the fin. They now have them on the bow. The fin, or the sail as the Americans call it, that, by the way, is the fin. It is not the conning tower. The conning tower is a hatch that leads from inside the submarine up into the fin. The fin is basically a shroud around hydraulically operated masts and will stop any flow of water over those fittings from making a noise. The early American submarines, the nuclear submarines in particular, had fin planes, hydroplanes on the side of the fin. They were for a number of reasons. The submarines were very fast, very agile. Having them mounted further back on the fin gave the submarine Ron understands this, a different centre of gravity, a different angle to go down on. You're not going to put the backside out of the water. They're very, very manoeuvrable. But there'd been advances in bow planes, and the fin is, as I said, is free flooding. It'll flood with water when you dive. Same as the casing along the top of the submarine. That's non-pressurised, but it will flood when you dived. That covers the top of the pressure hull. Along the top of the pressure hull there's hatch covers, pipes, valves, mufflers, bottle groups, all sorts of projections and fittings. And if water was allowed to flow freely over those fittings, it would make a noise. So it would not only make the submarine audible to other vessels, but would certainly detract from your own sonar operations. So the body of water that's trapped within inside the casing and the fin will remain still as a submarine manoeuvres through the water dive. Submarines don't travel in a straight line. They're continually insinuating, circling, changing depth, fully three-dimensional. You're doing that to clear your sonar arcs. The option, of course, do we build the Astutes or do we build the Virginias? And the Americans and the British have both said no, they won't build them for us. So the option is the AUKUS submarine, a new design, a totally new design. It will be built in Australia, it'll be built in South Australia. The only part that won't be built in South Australia is the nuclear reactor. And that will come from either the US or the UK, and that will be fitted into the hull. The submarines will be built at Osborne Naval Yard. Now, I have fond memories of Osborne. Initially, it was this little bit here, and that little jetty or protrusion there was owned by a company called Eglo Engineering. Eglo Engineering built ferries. They built ferries for the Kangaroo Island run, and they managed to get a grant from the South Australian and federal governments to build a synchro lift. They built the ferries in there, they rolled them out on a rail track onto the synchro lift, and the synchro lift just sank down into the river and they'd float them free. That is where they built the Collins class submarines. This is where they have built the Hobart class missile destroyers, the air warfare destroyers. So they have the ship up in a big shed, if you like. If you go down to Henderson, I think it's CivMec, they've got a shed the size of Alaska down there. It's huge, and that's to build the ships inside. They build them inside the shed, out of the weather. When I first went to Osborne, this area here was surrounded by a huge fence made out of railway sleepers, and it was probably about 4 metres, 5 metres high. And that was the headquarters of the local bikie group. The government wanted a greenfield site. The bikies said, this is our land. That fence won't stand up against the bulldozer, and they just moved to the next suburb. But that is a very good complex now. That employs around about 5,000 people. It's probably one of the largest employers in South Australia. And they are currently building offshore patrol vessels. They will build the new frigates, the Hunter-class frigates, if that ever gets off the ground. Who knows?
The 3 countries?
Yes, it is. Actually, it's a design team from not only the UK and the US and Australia, but also Germany, Canada, a few other countries. Like when they built the F-35 Lightning, they had all these countries chipping in to build it. And that's what they did with the design of the AUKUS submarine. They wanted everybody to come up. If you look closely at this, you'll see that the AUKUS submarine is covered in what's called anechoic tiles, little square tiles. They're a rubber tile, they're sound absorbing. The Brits love them, we don't. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I've yet to see a Brit submarine come into port without 20 or 30 of these things missing. And at a couple of $1,000s a pop, you can buy a new car or another swimming pool. Super glue. They use a glue that is so powerful that the workers in the shipyard were complaining their boots were stuck to the deck. They couldn't get it, had to take them off. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Incredible. Was it? To every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So at the beginning I posed you a question. What do submarines do? Well, they can't be employed to convey heads of state on official visit. I've taken Bob Hawke to sea. He liked it.
Why did you bring him back?
Because he was paying me at the time. But they can't be used for this purpose. They can't be utilised to host official functions for visiting dignitaries. Warships are good for that. You get the Defence Minister from the UK come over. Actual fact, David Cameron and anyway, some head honchos from the British government are coming to Australia this week, and they're going to be on a function on one of the big amphibious ships over in Sydney. Submarines can't do that. Submarines cannot do that. Submarines are limited use in humanitarian relief missions. I can tell you a story about this. I was on a submarine in the early 70s. We're out in the Pacific. We got called to go to a port in New Zealand called Gisborne. They had just had an earthquake that had destroyed their power station. Now, Gisborne's a major fishing port. They've got about 30 ocean-going trawlers, massive industrial freezers with millions and millions of dollars of frozen seafood. Lose that, their economy was gone. We tied up in Gisborne, hooked up to their power grid, and for the next 5 days we sat there and generated power to a community of 60,000 people. Wow. And we sailed out of there with a ton of crayfish on board. There you go. But you're limited use. We can't go and provide medical evacuations, nothing. We don't have the room. And to that effect, submarines are solely a weapon of war. That's what they're for. Sink ships. And they're very effective at that. But submarines are also a very, very good intelligence collector. You can get into places, you can listen to things, you can observe things. During World War II, one of the American submarines got so close to the Japanese home islands, they actually filmed through the periscope a horse race. And the entire crew were made honorary members of the New York Jockey Club. So you can do things that people don't understand. We carry special forces, yes, the cement heads, yeah. We can land them. Well, that's what you call them, cement heads. SAS, soft as soap. They don't like that. Yeah, nuclear submarines. They're the way ahead. They solve a number of problems. But there's one problem they don't solve. And that is, the one thing that restricts all submarines is the amount of food you can carry. I've sailed out on missions and you've got cartons of food stacked up down the passageways. You've got to crawl over it until you eat your way down through the tin sausages. Some years ago, a British chef called Hester Blumenthal approached the British Navy and said, I can do this. And he made these vacuum-packed meals. All you do is put them in a microwave. But that was well and good. And the meals were nutritious. They were great. They fed the crew. But you've got 100 crew, and each one's standing there with his meal, waiting for the microwave. You're number 95, you're going to get a little bit hacked off. The first submarines that were built were A class. So they were A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, A6 and so on. Then the next submarines were B class, B1, B2, B3, B4, B5 and so on. C class, D class, E class, all the way along. Even the Americans had them. In, I think it was 1941, Winston Churchill said, we should name our submarines. The gallant men in submarines need a name on their vessel, not like a number that's on the dastardly German U-boats. And so he suggested one of the T-class submarines be called Tiptoe. And so it was, HMS Tiptoe. And so they started naming their submarines. The Americans also did that. At the outbreak of World War II, their submarines were R-class, S-class, H-class and so on. But then they started to give them names. Time heals all wounds. But then again, time wounds all heals. So some of the French are a little... One of the things that amazed me was that a naval group that were the French construction company, said, we've had to dismiss 2,500 workers. You need 2,500 workers to design a submarine? They had no intention of building the submarines in Australia. They wanted them in France. And it was a political thing that the French government used. Look at these rotten Australians, you know, they're sacking all our poor men. Let's go back in history. In March 1942, when the Japanese invaded the Netherlands East Indies, now Indonesia, the Japanese Navy wanted to advance on Australia, but the Japanese Army didn't. They said they did not have enough men to do it. The Japanese Navy dispatched a squadron of ships. If I remember rightly, there was a battleship and about 4 big cruisers. They have a look down the west coast, and the one ship they encountered was a sloop. This thing, no bigger than a tugboat, commanded by a fellow called Oscar Rankin. And Rankin saw these ships at about 7 in the morning. He was escorting a group of merchant ships to Fremantle. He told them, head for Fremantle. And he sailed into this lot and engaged them. And the Japanese command thought, this guy is fighting us so hard, he's obviously delaying us for a major force to come up and engage us. So they turned around and went back. I refer to Oscar Rankin as the man who saved Australia, because they could have walked into here. They could have walked into here.
So he survived?
No.
Named a Collins class submarine.
Yeah, named a Collins class submarine after him.
Blew him out of the water.
Blew him out of the water, yeah.
How do girls, are women allowed to be accommodated on Australian side?
They are on the Collins class. The Collins class have 6 people cabins. 2 of the submarines have allocated 2 of the cabins for females. They're the pink boats. In 1982, the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands. And they did so in the belief that the British Royal Navy was not in a position to come down and challenge them. Boy, were they wrong. But one of the things that did occur there was a British submarine called HMS Conqueror, torpedoed and sunk the cruiser General Belgrano. The Belgrano was of no military value. It was 500 miles away from the combat zone. They sunk it to send a message. We've got submarines here. And it had the desired effect. The Argentine fleet went back into port and never came out again. If you've got submarines in your navy, other countries will think twice about coming into your waters. Right, one of the main reasons the French Submarine class submarine was rejected was that the French reactors are powered by what's called low yield uranium, about 3% enriched, which means they'd have to be refuelled every 5 to 7 years. Enriching uranium. Uranium is an ore that's extracted from the ground, and it comprises 3 isotopes. U-238, which comprises about 99% of the uranium, U-235, which is an active component, and U-234. 235 accounts for around about 0.7%, whereas the 234 accounts for the rest. The 235 is the uranium you need to run a reactor. So enriching it is basically removing the other isotopes. So they're removing 99%. The U-238, and they've got to get rid of the U-234 as well. As you can imagine, it's an expensive and time-consuming process. As I say, the French submarines have low-yield uranium, 3 to 5%, so they have to be refuelled every 7 to 10 years. The British and Americans run at 93% enrichment, which means the submarines have to be refuelled about every 35 years. It's a bit of a no-brainer.
And the enriched stuff is weapons grade, I think.
Yes, the enriched stuff is weapons grade, but you're not using that much of it. To get it weapons grade, to have a bomb go off, you need a detonation. So you need a conventional explosive to detonate that U-235, which they don't have in a reactor. You must assume probably not the right word, but you must assume that the enemy has at least your capabilities. Yes, there are advances in anti-submarine warfare, but the one thing I'd say is you have to find them first. The ocean is like a swimming pool. The top 10 feet of the ocean and the bottom 10 feet of the atmosphere are salt enriched, and they're hot, or hotter. You go to the swimming pool, one of your 27 swimming pools. You put your hand in and it's nice and warm, but you jump in and that far below the surface it's like ice. And that's the same with the ocean. There are layers. And the submarine will do will release what's called a bathythermograph. The bathythermograph is a plumb bob connected to the submarine. It'll drop down through the depths and it'll read back into the submarine a temperature versus depth down to about 2,000 metres. We call that the SOFAR axis. Any change in velocity is due to pressure, not to temperature. But now we've got a three-dimensional picture of the ocean. It's called a thermocline. And within the submarine systems, they have the ability to inject a frequency. We might know that you're familiar with Sun Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, The Art of War. Rule number 1 that he said, know your enemy. The submarine sailors know the surface ships inside out. They know what they're like. They know what they've got, how they work. They know the frequencies of everything. They can tell you when you flush the toilet. They know. So what we can do is inject into those systems the frequency of that sonar and see how it will react to the water, to the different temperatures. And we can hide in what's called hard layers or soft layers. You can go underneath them. You can set your depths and so on. They won't know you're there. Okay, the AUKUS submarine, by 2030 they want to start looking at getting it underway. I have heard that the year 2043 is saying that they will start to have them built in Australia. They can't build the 8 here as yet, but if they want to fast track this, the proposal is that they buy 3 of the Virginia class submarines from the Americans. The Americans have said they will not build submarines for us. But the first 3 Virginias, the Virginia, the Texas and the Hawaii, by 2033 will be due for overhaul and refuel, and they may well sell them to us. And they would be a bargain buy. Contrary to popular belief, Navy food was pretty good. Submarine food's even better because the cooks have to live with you.
This chef could have had his own TV programme.
Yeah, the submarine cooks are very, very good. They're very good. They're chef managers. They go off and do management courses. They know how to, they're nutritionists. They know how to plan meals. You can go onto any submarine and say, what are we having for lunch on October the 23rd next year? And they can tell you. If you allow, just indulge me for a moment with the command structure of a submarine. Now, tugboats and ferries have skippers, submarines have captains. His name is Sir. He's about 30 to 35. He's held in the utmost respect by the crew for his qualifications. They are crackerjack young guys. Of the crew on the submarine, there's only 2 men who answer directly to the captain. The first is the senior commissioned officer, the executive officer. He's known to everybody on board as Jimmy the One. Jimmy the One's next job is to go to a command course, take a command of his own if he's good enough. He's responsible to the captain for the submarine, the upkeep, maintenance, fuelling, stowage, the operational status of the boat. All submarines are called boats no matter how big they are, because you get on a ship, you get in a boat. The other man is a senior enlisted man on board, is known as the operations chief or the chief of the boat. And he's responsible to the captain for the crew, the discipline, welfare, training, the feeding of the crew, the day-to-day running of the submarine. The chief of the boat, within the Navy, there are different ranks and they're called MABs, maybe any branch. And the chief of the boat is that. One of the submarines has a female chief radio operator as the chief of the boat. So yes, the cook can become the chief of the boat. Whenever an incident occurs on a submarine in the United States Navy, the captain, the executive officer, the chief of the boat are off. They're relieved of their positions. Right. Yes, there have been instances of submarines sinking submarines, and the weapons we have, including the Mark 48 torpedo, can be set to sink submarines. Right. There are 3 types of submarines that you're going to see around the world today. One are called the boomers. They're the big ballistic missile armed submarines. They're 20 to 40,000 tonnes. They carry up to 24 intercontinental ballistic missiles with 10 nuclear warheads on each one. They can blow the world up on their own. They're called the boomers, or the Brits call them the bombers. There's the FABs, the fast attack boats, nuclear powered attack submarines that are designed to race out to a combat area, unleash a dozen cruise missiles and then race back. And there's the hunter-killer submarines, which are usually conventional, and they'll sit in choke points and wait for the boomers and the FABs to come through and take them out. You'll hear them coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Gary, obviously you know your subject inside out. And
Well, I know
just
about
a
submarines.
Mark of a
Oh, thank you very much.
little certificate in there.
Thank you.